This is Miss McNally, and I'm going to go ahead and go over the notes with you on a video so you can kind of hear me tell you what's going on rather than just reading the PowerPoint. So, we are starting a new unit. We're going to start the Cold War today, and it happens pretty much right after World War II. Alright, so at the end of World War II, you had a total between 50 to 60 million people die worldwide, with the Soviet Union losing the most people. You have to do a lot of reconstruction because cities all over Europe and Japan were virtually left in ruins. You also have people that still lived there, though, so you have survivors who are suffering from hunger, shortages of supplies, you have widespread disease, and pretty much everything is still in shambles, even though the war is over. So, you already kind of read about the Yalta Conference in February 1945, so this is right before the end of the war, where the Allied leaders agreed to split Germany into 4 zones. So, the Soviet Union got the one in the red, in green you've got Britain, France you've got the blue, and the United States has the orange. Now, the US, Britain, and France kind of morphed them all together, and that's going to be called West Germany. East Germany is going to be the part that the Soviet Union has, so that part in the red. And Berlin is also going to be split because it is the capital. Alright, so the Cold War, a lot of it is differences on opinions. So the Soviet Union and the US were the only remaining superpowers left in the world after the war. So the Allied powers are actually going to split. The Soviet Union is going to kind of break off, and mainly it's because they're communist and the rest of them aren't. So you get a Cold War. Now, the term Cold War is an actual definition. It's a state of tension and hostility among nations without armed conflict between the major rivals. So the major rivals in this instance are going to be the US and the Soviet Union. And it's called a Cold War because they never actually go to war with one another. Alright, so Stalin. He is the leader of the Soviet Union. We have talked a lot about Stalin. So, he had 2 main goals. He wants to spread communist ideas to Eastern Europe and eventually the world. So, he wants everyone to be communist. And he wants to create a buffer zone of friendly governments as a defense against Germany. So, here is your new map. So, you're going to have 2 new alliances that we're going to talk about in just a minute. You're going to have the Warsaw Pact nations that are in the orange. That's the Soviet Union side. And then you've got NATO. And that's pretty much everyone else. Yugoslavia is kind of one of those weird ones where they're not part of the Warsaw Pact, but they are communist. Alright. So, the US and Western European objectives after the war. So, this is what the US and the Western countries want. They felt the Soviet Union's control of Eastern Europe divided the continent. They're going to say it created an iron curtain that separated Europe. It's not an actual curtain, it's not a wall, it's just like a border. Winston Churchill's going to coin that term. So, the Western nations, they're afraid of communism spreading. They don't like communism, and they haven't for a long time. They exploited the division of Europe, so they're going to bring attention that half of it's communist, half of it's not. They want democratic governments and principles, so they want democracies, more of like what the US has. So, new peace organizations. Your first one's the United Nations, and this still exists today. So, in 1945, the UN is created. You have 50 countries joined initially. You have over 193 today. So, the goal was to play a greater role in world affairs. The main objective is to ensure peace. So, it's kind of like the League of Nations, only they'll actually do something if something happens. So, other jobs of the UN, they prevent outbreaks of disease, they improve worldwide education, protect refugees, aiding underdeveloped nations. They do a lot. So, each member of the nation has 1 vote, and majority rules. You have much smaller bodies of 12 nations total that make up the Security Council, where you have 5 permanent nations. So, the 5 permanent nations will always be there. They're responsible for maintaining international peace and security. They have more power than the General Assembly, so these are kind of like your top dogs in the UN. The 5 countries that are permanent on the council is the United States, France, Great Britain, the Soviet Union, and China, which are the former allies during World War II. So they have the power to veto, which means to reject or pretty much say no to UN decisions and override majority rule. They have the power to apply economic sanctions, so that means you're not trading with people. They have the power to send peacekeeping or military forces to resolve conflicts. So these guys can decide whether or not the UN is going to send in troops. Now, the UN does have its own small military. They're not that big and they're really not that powerful. But what they rely on is other countries bringing their militaries to help out. So, one of the big things that the UN does right off the bat is they create a new nation. So after World War I, Great Britain and France carved the Middle East into mandated or dependent territories. That's from imperialism. After World War II, France and Great Britain allow these mandates to become states, so they become their own country in the Middle East. That's where you get Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, and Israel. Now, Israel is the first major action of the UN, and it's pretty highly debated. So, Great Britain supported the idea of a Jewish nation homeland and part of Great Britain's mandated Palestine. Due to the Holocaust, many nations around the world called for a Jewish state. So, they wanted to give part of the land that was Palestine to the Jewish people to form Israel, because they were still technically owned by Great Britain. So, in 1947, the U.S. approves the plan to divide Palestine into a half Arab, half Jewish state. The Jewish people accept the plan, but the Arabs rejected it. They said all of Palestine should be theirs. Now, there is a lot of tension still there. There is a lot of fighting. Great Britain handles it for like a year, and then they eventually leave. So, some people say that Israel shouldn't even exist. It should be all of Palestine. Some people think that Israel has a right to be there. It's a huge world conflict that still bleeds into today. There are still wars, there's still conflicts. There hasn't been a resolution to that yet. Alright, so let's talk about different goals between the US and the USSR, which is the Soviet Union. So after World War II, the US and the Soviet Union had different goals to meet. The US wanted democracy to spread, and they wanted communism to stay right where it is. So this policy is known as containment. You need to know what containment is. It's also part of the Truman Doctrine. So they want to contain communism to where it is. So stop it from spreading. Make sure it stays right where it is. You guys are also going to need to know that in American history next year. So they're going to build international alliances. NATO is the first one. And they're going to give economic aid to European nations, which is called the Marshall Plan. So they're going to give money to European nations to help rebuild after World War II. So the USSR, they want communism to spread all around the world. They want to take over border countries to protect itself, so create a buffer zone just in case people try to attack them. Future of East Germany and Poland, they want them to become Soviet Union controlled areas. They're going to force East Germany to help pay for the war damages of World War II. Kind of like what happened in World War I, and you saw how well that played out. Oppose all help from Western European, US, and all democratic nations. So they won't accept any help from them if it is offered. Alright, so they do have a couple similarities. They both helped create the United Nations, or the UN. They do promote world peace. They don't really want a war. No one really wants a war. They work on world problems, so epidemics and education, like the coronavirus. So, competing for world domination, they both want to be the number one in control. They both have zones in Germany that they control. The Soviet Union has the East. West Germany is the US and the Western nations. Both want to spread their style of government. So, on one side, you've got the United States, a democracy, and your other side, you have the Soviet Union, which is communist. Alright. So, what's going to happen is the U.S. is going to take a leading role in trying to stop the Soviet Union from expanding and spreading communism. They do it with a couple things. The Truman Doctrine, the Marshall Plan, and NATO. Alright, so the Truman Doctrine, 1947. So, it's a U.S. program to stop the spread of communism formed by President Truman. That's why it's called the Truman Doctrine. They are going to offer poor nations likely to fall to communism some aid. So, the United States would give military and economic aid to any country fighting communism. So, pretty much they would back them up in a war. This is going to really take place in Greece and Turkey, which almost fell to communism. So, the United States kind of steps in and helps out. Alright, next up, Marshall Plan, also 1947. It gave the U.S. financial aid to it gave the U.S. financial aid to rebuild Europe. So they would send money and try and help rebuild Europe, which makes them look really good in the eyes of those European countries. So they're going to give over $17 billion in aid, including food, machinery, and raw materials. The countries of Europe were pretty excited about this because it was more money that they could use to help rebuild their nations. And it made the United States look better than the Soviet Union because they didn't really help out. NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization of 1949. So you were going to have the U.S., Canada, Great Britain, France, Italy, and 6 smaller nations into a military alliance. This is going to be about stopping the spread of communism. So all 3 of those, the Truman Doctrine, Marshall Plan, and NATO, are all about stopping the spread of communism. So NATO also is going to maintain troops, military equipment, and weapons, warned that an attack against one member would be an attack against all members, kind of like a normal alliance. Now, you also have an alliance that the Soviet Union makes too. It's called the Warsaw Pact. So your new teams are NATO and the Warsaw Pact. So the Soviet Union and its communistic satellites, which is pretty much countries that they own, but they have some independence, form a military alliance called the Warsaw Pact. They're going to push the idea of communism, and it was a way to reject the NATO alliances. So everything in that dark navy blue, that is NATO. And everything in orange is the Warsaw Pact. So, like, what their satellites were would be like Bulgaria, Romania, Czechoslovakia. So, we need to talk about Berlin, because a lot goes on in Berlin, which is the capital of Germany. So, remember how I told you it is divided into 4 zones. Soviet Union, Britain, France, United States. But Berlin, as you can see, is technically in East Germany, where the Soviet Union has control. But it is, since it's the capital, they divide it up into 4 parts as well. So, Cold War tension divides Europe into East versus West. Berlin, Germany is the center of the divisional line between East versus West. So the Soviet Union, remember, they are communist. The United States is a democracy. The Soviet Union put a blockade to prevent East Germans from escaping to West Berlin in hopes for a better life. So what they would do is people in East Germany would try and go to West Berlin, where they could pretty much be safer and have democracy. So this is the city of Berlin, and it is divided up. So that orangish red, that is the communist side. And your democratic sides are where the other arrows. So even though it's in East Germany, the city itself was also divided up. So you have the Berlin crisis. This is an order of events where a couple different things happen. So in 1948 through 1949, the Soviets closed off the highways and the railways to democratic West Berlin, preventing supplies from getting into people from West Berlin. So if you look back in this map, they put up blockades all around West Berlin, so they couldn't get any supplies. So trying to like starve out the city. So the U.S. was concerned because the Soviets were trying to get away with taking over free West Berlin and forcing the U.S. to give up West Berlin to the Soviets. So pretty much making the people suffer, so the United States just gives up. The U.S. decided to fly in supplies instead because we have planes now with the Berlin airlift. So the Soviet Union didn't really plan this one out very well because apparently they forgot airplanes existed. So they opened up the highways anyways because it didn't really work. So here's a picture of what they would do. They would take off in East Germany and just drop supplies over into West Berlin, and everything worked really well. Here's a bunch of pictures, but they did like round-the-clock plane trips, getting all these supplies to people. Here's some kids, super excited. Some of the pilots would throw candy out to the kids, which made them really happy. So, the Berlin airlift is going to eventually lead to the Berlin Wall. So, in response to the Berlin airlift, the Soviet Union withdrew their blockade. Everything was well. But a total, you had 200,000 flights completed during the airlift. 1,000 arrivals and departures a day. 1.5 million tons of food and fuel were delivered. 3 trillion pounds of supplies total. But the Soviet Union had a different plan in 1961. By the way, by 1961, Stalin is dead. He dies in the 50s. The Soviet Union builds the Berlin Wall to divide the city and stop Eastern Berliners from escaping communism. So, what would happen was people in East Berlin would try and just cross over to West Berlin, and then they would live there. So they start building this wall, or they start the blockade overnight, and then they eventually keep building the wall. This thing's not coming down until 89. So it's going to be there for almost 30 years. So, East Berlin, there is an arrow pointing to it with West Berlin. They even had to start, like, boarding up windows because people would jump out windows to get over to the other side. So, here's a lady looking at it. If you tried to cross this wall, they would shoot you. So, had to be careful. So, I'm going to post this PowerPoint too, and you guys can click on the video. It shows you, like, what's going on and with the wall, and it shows people trying to escape it. So, I'm going to upload this video for you guys, and I'm going to give you this PowerPoint for you to use. Have a good one.